The morning they came to nail the foreclosure notice to her father's door, Pearl Garner stood on the porch with a shotgun she did not know how to fire, and a debt she had not known existed until 3 days before. It was the spring of 1887, in the high dry country of eastern Colorado, where the wind never truly stopped and the grass turned gold before it turned brown. The town of Prosperity Creek sat along a shallow river that had once run silver with trout and now mostly ran with dust when the rains failed. Pearl's father, Elias Garner, had built the largest cattle spread for 30 miles in any direction, the Garner Ranch, a name that had meant something once. Men had tipped their hats when they said it. Now the man who had built it was 6 weeks in his grave, taken by a fever that came on fast and left fast, and the name he had built meant only one thing to the bank in Denver: money owed. "Miss Garner," said the man from the bank, a thin fellow named Whitfield with spectacles that caught the morning sun so she could not see his eyes, "I understand this is difficult, but your father borrowed against this land 3 times over. The notes are due. I have no choice but to post the notice." "You have a choice," Pearl said. Her voice did not shake, though her hands did just slightly around the barrel of the gun. "Every man has a choice. You are choosing to take a dead man's failure out on his daughter." Whitfield had the decency to look uncomfortable at least. "The bank does not forgive debts because the borrower has passed, Miss Garner. I am sorry. You have 30 days to produce $800, or the ranch and all its stock become property of the Prosperity Creek Bank and Trust." He nailed the paper to the post beside the door, tipped his hat with a motion so practiced it looked like a reflex, and rode off toward town, leaving Pearl alone with the paper flapping in the wind and the weight of a life she had not chosen to inherit. She was 24 years old. She had buried her mother 11 years before, buried 2 brothers to the war before she was even born, and now she had buried her father, a proud man who had never once told her, in all his pride, that he had mortgaged every acre of the Garner Ranch to keep up appearances after 2 bad winters and a cattle disease that had taken half the herd. He had died believing, perhaps, that pride was a thing a man could pass down like land, something solid, something that would hold. Instead, he had left her a ledger book full of numbers that did not add up, and a name that men now said with pity instead of respect. Pearl went inside, set the shotgun by the door, and sat down at her father's desk. She opened the ledger again, though she had already read every line of it a dozen times since the funeral. $800. She had $41 in a coffee tin, 6 horses, 112 head of cattle that were more bone than beef after the winter, and a house with a roof that leaked in 3 places. She thought about her father's pride, how he had refused to sell off land even when the offers came fair, how he had refused to ask for help from neighbors, refused to admit weakness, refused, even at the end, gasping in his bed, to tell her the truth of what he owed. "The ranch will be fine, Pearl," he had said 2 days before he died. The Garner name is good in this territory. He had believed it even as it was already false. She would not make his mistake. She folded the foreclosure notice, walked out back past the barn to the small family plot where her mother and father lay beneath modest stone markers, and she dug a small hole beside her father's grave. Into it she placed the folded paper, and beside it, a strip of leather that had been cut from her father's best saddle, the one he had always kept oiled and polished even when they could not afford new boots for her. It was a foolish, sentimental thing to do, and she knew it even as she did it, but she needed some ceremony to mark what she was about to become. She was burying his pride and the shame of his debts right there in the dirt with him so that she could stand up from this ground as someone new, someone who owed nothing to a name, only to herself and to the $800 she intended to find. "I loved you, Papa," she said to the grave, "but I will not die proud and broke like you did. I am going to save this land, and I am going to do it my own way." She patted the dirt down with the flat of a shovel, and she walked back to the house to make a plan. The nearest neighbor to the Garner ranch was a man Pearl had heard of but never properly met, a former Union cavalry sergeant named Marcus Keller, who had come west 4 years earlier and bought up a modest spread along the eastern boundary of Garner land. He kept to himself, mostly, though the talk in Prosperity Creek painted him as capable and fair, a man who paid his hands on time and did not cheat at cards, which in that country counted for a great deal of character. He was 30 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of ranch work, with a quiet, watchful face that had been weathered by sun and something else, some old grief that people speculated about but never confirmed. Pearl had seen him twice before, at church gatherings and once at the general store, and both times he had struck her as a man who listened more than he spoke, which she found, if she were honest with herself, rather appealing in a country full of men who spoke a great deal and listened not at all. It was pure necessity that sent her to his door 3 days after the notice was nailed to her porch. She needed hands to help her gather and drive what remained of her herd, and she could not afford to hire strangers, not with $41 to her name. She rode to the Keller place on her father's old bay gelding, wearing her one good dress because she was not above using whatever advantage she had, and found Marcus Keller mending a fence at the edge of his property, his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbow and sweat darkening the back of his collar. "Mr. Keller," she called, reining in the bay. He looked up, and for a moment something crossed his face that she could not name, surprise perhaps, or something quieter. He set down his hammer and walked toward her, wiping his hands on his trousers. "Miss Garner," he said, "I was sorry to hear about your father. He was a hard man but a fair one from what I saw of him." "Thank you," Pearl said, and found she meant it, that small kindness landing somewhere tender. "Mr. Keller, I will not waste your time with pleasantries because I do not have much time to spare. My father left the ranch in debt, $800 due within 30 days or the bank takes everything. I have some cattle, more than I can gather and drive alone, and I need to sell what I can before the note comes due. I cannot pay you what your time is worth. But I am asking for your help anyway because I do not know who else to ask and because folks say you are an honest man." Marcus studied her for a long moment. She held his gaze, refusing to look away, refusing to let the desperation in her chest show on her face. "That is a great deal to ask a man you barely know," he said finally. "It is," Pearl agreed. "I am asking anyway." Something like the ghost of a smile moved at the corner of his mouth. "My father used to say the difference between pride and dignity is that pride will not ask, and dignity will ask and not be ashamed of the asking." He picked his hat up off the fence post and put it on. "I will help you gather your herd, Miss Garner. I have 2 hands of my own I can spare a few days a week, and I know a buyer in Cheyenne who pays fair for lean cattle if the story behind them is honest." Pearl felt something in her chest loosen, some fist she had not realized was clenched since the morning the notice went up. "I do not know how to thank you." "You can start," Marcus said, "by calling me Marcus. Mr. Keller makes me feel like my father and he was a difficult man to be. Then you must call me Pearl." "Pearl," he said, testing the name, and something about the way he said it, plain and unadorned, without the pitying softness most people used now when they spoke to her, made her throat tight with gratitude she did not have words for yet. They began the work the following morning. Marcus brought 2 of his hands, a lanky young cowboy named Tobias Reyes, who could not have been more than 20 and who blushed every time Pearl spoke to him directly, and an older man named Samuel Otto who said little, but worked harder than anyone Pearl had ever seen. Together with Pearl and Marcus, they spent 4 days combing the draws and coulees of Garner land, driving in cattle that had scattered during the hard winter, checking brands, separating what could be sold from what needed another season to fatten. It was grueling work, dawn until dusk, dust in every crease of skin and clothing, but Pearl found she did not mind it, found in fact that she came alive in it in a way she had not expected. She had spent her whole life on this ranch, had learned to ride before she could properly walk, But her father had always kept her at the edges of the real work, the driving and roping and branding, insisting a lady ought not to labor like a hired hand. Now, doing exactly that labor, side by side with Marcus Keller under a sky so blue it looked painted, she felt something unclench inside her that she had not known was tight. "You ride well," Marcus told her on the third evening, as they sat their horses at the top of a ridge watching the last of the gathered cattle bawl their way into the holding pen below. The sun was setting behind the mountains to the west, staining the sky the color of a bruise healing, purple and gold and rose. "My father taught me," Pearl said, "though he would have preferred I stayed home and let the men handle it." "Why didn't you?" Pearl considered the question. "Because I did not want to be the kind of woman who waits for someone else to save her. I watched my mother wait for my father to fix everything, and when he could not, she simply grew smaller and smaller until there was nothing left of her to grow. I decided a long time ago I would rather fail trying than fail waiting." Marcus was quiet for a moment, watching the cattle settle. "My wife," he said, and Pearl's breath caught slightly at the word, though he continued before she could ask. "She died 3 years ago. Fever, same as your father, near enough. She used to say something like that. That she would rather ride into trouble than sit still and let it come to her." He smiled, a small, sad thing. "She would have liked you, I think." "I am sorry," Pearl said softly, "for your loss." "It was a long time coming to peace with it," Marcus said, "but I have made my peace, mostly." He looked over at her, and in the fading light his eyes seemed very dark, very steady. "It is good, having someone to talk to about her without it feeling like pity. Most folks either avoid the subject or drown me in sympathy I do not want." "I know that feeling," Pearl said. "Since my father died, half the town speaks to me like I might shatter if they raise their voice too loud." "You do not strike me as a woman who shatters easily," Marcus said. "No," Pearl agreed, feeling something warm bloom in her chest at the plain honesty of the observation. "I do not think I do." They rode back to the ranch house in companionable silence as the stars began to needle through the darkening sky, and Pearl found herself, for the first time since her father's death, almost peaceful. The cattle drive to Cheyenne took 6 days each way, and Pearl insisted on going herself, over Marcus's initial objection that the trail was hard and dangerous for a woman traveling without more protection than 2 hired hands and 1 neighbor. "I am not asking your permission, Marcus," she said, not unkindly. "This is my herd, my debt, my ranch. I will not hide at home while other men decide my future for me." Marcus studied her, and whatever protest he had prepared seemed to die on his tongue. "No," he said slowly, "I suppose you would not." He paused. "I will not try to stop you again, but I am coming along, and that is not up for discussion either." Pearl found she did not mind that arrangement at all. The drive itself was hard in ways Pearl had not fully anticipated. Long days in the saddle under a punishing sun. Nights spent sleeping on hard ground with one ear always listening for trouble. The constant low anxiety of watching over 100 head of cattle that could bolt at a rattlesnake or a peal of distant thunder. But it was also, in its way, beautiful. She had never traveled beyond the boundaries of Prosperity Creek and the neighboring counties, and the open plains that stretched toward Wyoming territory filled something in her she had not known was empty. A sense of the world being larger than the $800 she owed, larger than her father's grave, larger than the small, tight life she had lived so far. On the 4th night, a storm rolled in fast from the northwest, black clouds stacking up like a wall, and the cattle grew restless and skittish, ears flicking, several of them beginning to bawl and shift toward the edges of the herd. "We need to keep them tight," Marcus called out over the rising wind, "or we will lose half of them to a stampede." Pearl spurred her horse toward the northern edge of the herd, where Tobias was struggling to hold a group of steers that had begun to break away, spooked by a crack of lightning that split the sky white and sudden. She got there just as one large steer bolted hard to the left, and without thinking, she cut her horse across its path, waving her hat and shouting, turning the animal back into the loose formation of the herd before it could pull others with it. The rain came then, hard and cold, needling sideways in the wind, and for the better part of an hour Pearl and Marcus and the two hands rode the perimeter of the herd, turning back animals that tried to break, shouting to be heard over the thunder and the rain, soaked through to the skin, exhausted, frightened, and somehow, beneath all of it, exhilarated. When the storm finally passed and the herd had settled into a nervous, huddled stillness, Pearl found herself beside Marcus at the edge of camp, both of them dripping, both of them breathing hard, both of them, she realized with some surprise, grinning. "You rode that steer down like you were born to it," Marcus said, water running off the brim of his hat. "I suppose some part of me was," Pearl said. She was shivering now that the adrenaline had begun to fade, the cold rain finally registering against her skin. Marcus noticed, and without a word he swung down from his horse, retrieved a dry blanket from his saddlebag, and draped it over her shoulders himself, his hands lingering a moment longer than was strictly necessary at the collar of it, adjusting it against the wind. Pearl looked up at him, close enough now that she could see the rain caught in his eyelashes, the small scar above his left eyebrow she had never noticed before, and something passed between them, wordless and warm, that neither of them acknowledged aloud but that both of them, she was certain, felt with equal weight. "Thank you," she said quietly. "You are welcome," he said, just as quietly, and neither of them moved for a long moment, standing there in the wet dark with the smell of rain and cattle and wood smoke from the small fire Samuel had managed to coax alive nearby, until Tobias called out that supper was ready. And the spell, if it had been a spell, broke, and they returned to camp separately, though Pearl found she carried the warmth of that moment with her the rest of the drive. Cheyenne, when they finally reached it, was a bustling railhead town, full of noise and dust, and the lowing of thousands of cattle waiting to be shipped east. The buyer Marcus knew, a broker named Higgins, examined Pearl's herd with a critical eye, noting the leanness of the animals, the marks of a hard winter still visible in their ribs. "These are not prime stock, Miss Garner," Higgins said, chewing on the end of an unlit cigar. "I could offer you $4 a head, maybe 4.25 given the numbers." Pearl felt her stomach drop. At that price, even selling the entire herd, she would come nowhere close to the $800 she needed. She opened her mouth to argue, though she was not certain what argument she had. "Higgins," Marcus said before she could speak, his voice calm but with an edge of steel beneath it that Pearl had not heard from him before, "you and I both know these cattle are leaner than they ought to be because of the winter, not because of poor management. Elias Garner ran a tight operation for 20 years before he passed, and his daughter has kept it running since with less help and less money than any man in this territory would have managed. These cattle will fatten fine on summer grass, and you know it, because you have been buying lean spring cattle for 15 years and turning a profit reselling them fat in the fall. 5.5 a head, or we take them down the rail line to Rob's yard and see what he offers." Higgins chewed his cigar a while longer, studying Marcus with an expression that suggested he was recalculating something. 5.25, he said finally, "and that is because I like you, Keller, and because I do not care to make the trip down to Rob's myself to see what fool price he is quoting these days." 5.5, Marcus said, unmoving, "or we walk." There was a long silence. Pearl held her breath. 5.5, Higgins said at last, spitting to the side in evident disgust at his own capitulation. "You are a hard man to deal with, Keller." "I have had good teachers," Marcus said, and for the first time that day, something like a real smile crossed his face. When the count was finished and the money paid, Pearl found herself holding more cash than she had ever held in her life, $616, still short of the $800 she needed, but far more than she had believed possible 3 days before. "I do not know how to repay you for that," she said to Marcus as they walked back toward the hotel where they would spend the night before the ride home, the noise of the railhead town swirling around them, the smell of coal smoke and manure and fried food from a nearby cookhouse. "You do not need to repay me anything," Marcus said. "You built that herd through a hard winter with your father sick and then dying, and you drove it 200 miles with more grit than most men I have served alongside. I only made sure Higgins did not cheat a grieving woman because he thought she would not know better. The credit is yours." Pearl stopped walking, and Marcus stopped beside her, looking down at her with a question in his eyes. "You keep doing that," she said. "Giving me credit I am not sure I have earned." "You have earned every bit of it," Marcus said, his voice low and certain. "Pearl, I have known a great many people in my life who talked about grit and character and pride, and precious few who actually possessed it when the trial came. You possess it. I would be a poor judge of character if I did not say so." Pearl felt her eyes sting unexpectedly, and she looked away, toward the noise and bustle of the street, embarrassed by the sudden well of emotion. "My father used to say pride was the only inheritance worth passing down," she said. "I have come to think he was wrong. Pride kept him from telling me the truth about the debts until it was too late to do anything gentle about it. I would rather leave whatever children I have something more useful than pride." "What would you leave them instead?" Marcus asked, and there was something careful in the way he asked it, as though the question mattered to him beyond simple curiosity. Pearl considered it, the noise of Cheyenne fading into the background of her thoughts. "The willingness to ask for help," she said finally. "The sense to know the difference between failing and giving up. And maybe," she added, glancing up at him, "the good fortune to have neighbors who show up when the storm comes instead of after it has already passed." Marcus held her gaze, and something passed between them again. That same wordless warmth from the storm, stronger now, harder to ignore. "I think," he said slowly, "that is a fine inheritance to leave anyone." They did not speak of it further that night, though Pearl lay awake in her narrow hotel bed thinking of the way he had looked at her, and suspected, from the long silence in the room beside hers, that Marcus Keller was not sleeping easily either. They arrived back at Prosperity Creek 11 days after they had left, tired, sunburned, and short still of the full $800, but with hope where before there had only been dread. Pearl had $616 from the cattle sale, plus her original $41, bringing her to $657, $143 short of what the bank demanded. She had 11 days remaining before the note came due. "I could lend you the difference," Marcus said, as they sat on the porch of the Garner ranch house the evening they returned, drinking coffee Pearl had brewed too strong from exhaustion and not particularly caring. "I have it to spare." Pearl shook her head immediately. "No, absolutely not. I did not go through all of this to trade one debt for another, Marcus, even a debt to a friend." "It would not be a debt in the way you mean it," Marcus said. "It would be exactly that," Pearl said, more sharply than she intended, and then, seeing the flicker of hurt cross his face, softened. "I am sorry. I do not mean to be ungrateful. You have already given me more help than I had any right to ask for, but I need to find the rest myself, Marcus. If I do not, then all of this," she gestured at the ranch, the barn, the fields beyond, "will always feel like something I was given rather than something I earned back. Do you understand?" Marcus was quiet a long moment, turning his coffee cup slowly in his hands. "I understand," he said finally. "It is the same reason I did not let my brother buy out my share of our father's place in Ohio when I decided to come west, even though he offered generous terms. Some things a person needs to build with their own two hands, or the building does not mean what it should." "Yes," Pearl said, relieved he understood without her needing to explain further. "Exactly that." "Then we will find another way," Marcus said. "What do you have left to sell?" Pearl thought about it. There was little left of real value. The cattle already sold, the horses too few and too necessary to part with, the house itself mortgaged along with the land. But then she remembered something, a detail from her father's ledger she had dismissed as unimportant weeks before. "My father held a note," she said slowly, working it through, "from a man named Cyrus Bell, over in the next county. Bell borrowed $200 from him 3 years ago, for seed and equipment, promised to pay it back with interest inside a year. He never did, and my father never pushed him on it, because Belle's wife was sick that whole year, and Papa always had a soft spot for a man in hard circumstance, even when he could not admit his own hard circumstances to his own daughter. There was bitterness in her voice at that last part that she could not quite suppress. $200 would cover what you are short with some left besides, Marcus said. If Belle has it to pay, Pearl said, and if he is willing. Then we will go ask him, Marcus said, standing. Tomorrow, there is no sense waiting on it. Cyrus Bell's farm was a modest operation 2 counties over, a full day's ride, and when Pearl and Marcus arrived the following afternoon, they found a man who looked older than his years, weathered by hard work and harder luck, his wife thin but recovered, working in a small garden beside the house. Belle listened to Pearl's explanation with an expression of growing shame, and when she finished, he removed his hat and held it against his chest like a man at a funeral. "Miss Garner," he said, "I am ashamed to tell you I do not have $200 to my name, not in cash. This farm barely feeds my family some years. Your father was kind enough not to press me on the debt, and I confess I let his kindness become an excuse to forget it entirely, which was wrong of me, and I am sorry for it." Pearl felt her hope crumble, but she kept her voice level. "I understand, Mr. Bell. I am not here to ruin you, but I am in a difficult position myself, and I had hoped—" "I do not have cash," Bell interrupted, "but I have 11 hogs ready for market, and a wagon and team I could spare, and I would rather settle an honest debt than carry the shame of it another season. Would livestock and equipment toward the value owed satisfy you, if I made up whatever difference remained with labor? I'm handy with carpentry, and I heard your barn roof needs mending." Pearl looked at Marcus, who gave a small nod, leaving the decision entirely to her. "That would satisfy me, Mr. Bell," Pearl said, "and I thank you for your honesty. My father would have appreciated it, I think, more than he ever let on." They drove the hogs and wagon back toward Prosperity Creek over the following 2 days, selling the hogs at the stockyard for a total of $160, less than the full debt but enough, combined with what remained from the cattle sale, to bring Pearl's total to $817. It was enough. With 3 days to spare before the note came due, Pearl Garner walked into the Prosperity Creek Bank and Trust and laid $800 on Whitfield's desk, counted out in small, worn bills that represented every ounce of grit she had spent the last month gathering. "This settles the note in full," she said, "and I expect a paper saying so signed and dated before I leave this office." Whitfield, to his credit, did not argue. He counted the money twice, wrote out a receipt, and signed a release of the mortgage with his own hand, sliding it across the desk to her. "I confess, Miss Garner," he said, adjusting his spectacles, "I did not expect you to manage it. Most in your position would not have." "Most in my position did not have good neighbors," Pearl said, folding the release carefully and tucking it into her bag, "and did not have a father's stubborn pride to prove wrong." She walked out of that bank into the bright spring sunlight feeling lighter than she had felt in months, feeling, for the first time since her father's death, that the ground beneath her was solid, that the future was something she was building rather than something happening to her. Marcus was waiting outside with the horses, and when he saw her face, he did not need to ask whether it was done. "You did it," he said. "We did it," Pearl corrected, and before she quite knew what she was doing, she stepped forward and embraced him, right there on the main street of Prosperity Creek in full view of anyone who cared to look, and Marcus's arms came around her without hesitation, solid and warm, and for a long moment neither of them let go. "I could not have done this without you," she murmured against his shoulder. "You could have," Marcus said quietly, his voice rough. "You would have found another way. But I am glad, more glad than I can say, that I got to be part of how it happened." When they finally stepped back from each other, both a little flushed, both aware of the several townsfolk now openly watching them with undisguised curiosity, Pearl laughed, a real, unguarded laugh, the first in what felt like years. "I suppose we have given the town something to talk about," she said. "I do not mind," Marcus said, "if you do not." "I do not mind at all," Pearl said, and meant it entirely. The months that followed were not without their difficulties, but they were the good kind of difficulty, the kind that comes with building rather than merely surviving. Pearl threw herself into restoring the Garner ranch to something like its former strength, though she was determined to do it differently than her father had, with honest accounting and careful planning rather than borrowed pride. She kept meticulous records now, learned from a book on ranch management she ordered by mail from Denver, and consulted Marcus often on matters of breeding and grazing rotation, finding that their two operations, run side by side, made more sense combined in their thinking than they ever had kept separate. Marcus, for his part, found excuses to ride over to the Garner place with increasing frequency, ostensibly to check on a fence line or discuss the movement of a shared water source, though both of them understood, without ever quite saying so aloud, that the excuses had become secondary to the visits themselves. It was in early summer, nearly 4 months after the note had been paid, that matters between them finally came to a point neither could avoid any longer. Pearl had ridden out to check on the northern pasture, the one bordering Keller land, and found Marcus already there, sitting his horse at the fence line, watching the sunset paint the sky in long streaks of amber and rose. "You are out here often these evenings," Pearl observed, drawing her horse up alongside his. "The view is good," Marcus said, though his eyes, when he glanced at her, suggested the view he referred to was not entirely the sky. Pearl felt her cheeks warm and looked away toward the horizon, giving herself a moment to gather her thoughts. "Marcus," she said finally, "I think we ought to speak plainly with one another. I have never been a woman inclined toward games, and I do not intend to start now." "I would welcome plain speaking," Marcus said, and there was something in his voice, a carefulness, that told her he had been waiting for this conversation as much as she had. "I care for you," Pearl said, the words coming out simpler than she had rehearsed them, but true for their simplicity. "Not merely as a neighbor or a friend who helped me through a hard season. I think I have cared for you since the night of the storm on the drive to Cheyenne, when you gave me your blanket and I looked up and understood all at once that I did not want to look away from you." Marcus was quiet for a long moment, and Pearl's heart hammered against her ribs in the silence, wondering if she had misjudged, if the warmth she had felt between them had been one-sided after all. Then he swung down from his horse, came around to her side and reached up to help her down as well, his hands at her waist as her feet found the ground, and he did not step back once she was standing, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him in the cooling evening air. "Pearl," he said, "I buried my wife 3 years ago, and I told myself afterward that I had made my peace with being alone, that the ranch and the work were enough, that I did not need to risk that kind of loss again. And then you rode up to my fence line 4 months ago with a shotgun you did not know how to use and a debt you refused to run from, and I have not had an easy night's sleep since, because every time I close my eyes I see your face, and I think about how much I do not want to spend the rest of my life pretending I do not feel what I feel for you." "And what do you feel?" Pearl asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I love you," Marcus said, simply, without hesitation, the words carrying the weight of a man who had thought them through many times before finally speaking them aloud. "I have loved you for months, and I did not say it because I did not want you to think I was helping you out of some hope for repayment of that kind. But it is the truth, and I would rather you know it than have me carry it silent any longer." Pearl felt tears rise unbidden, and she did not fight them this time. "I love you too, Marcus Keller," she said. "I think I have loved you since you stood up to Higgins in Cheyenne and gave me credit I was not sure I deserved. I have never in my life felt so seen by another person as I have felt around you these past months." Marcus's hand came up to cup her cheek, gentle, reverent, and Pearl leaned into the touch without hesitation. "May I kiss you, Pearl?" he asked, his voice rough with feeling. "You had better," Pearl said, and he did, tenderly at first and then with a growing certainty, there at the fence line between their two properties as the sun finished its descent, and the first stars began to prick through the darkening sky. And Pearl thought, in the small clear part of her mind still capable of thought, that this was exactly the kind of ceremony she should have expected all along. Two lives that had grown alongside each other finally, naturally, joining as one. They were married that autumn, in a small ceremony at the Garner ranch house that Pearl had grown up in, now free of debt and slowly returning to prosperity under her careful management. The preacher from Prosperity Creek presided, and half the town turned out for the celebration afterward, drawn by curiosity as much as genuine goodwill. Though by the end of the evening, with fiddle music playing and tables groaning under the weight of dishes brought by neighbors, even the most skeptical among them seemed to have been won over by the evident happiness of the match. Tobias Reyes, grown a little less bashful over the months of working alongside Pearl, gave a toast that made half the guests laugh and the other half tear up, praising Pearl's grit on the cattle drive and Marcus's stubbornness in negotiating with Higgins, declaring the two of them, matched like a good horse and a good saddle, each better for having the other. Samuel Otto, never a man of many words, simply shook Marcus's hand at the end of the evening and said, "You found a good one," which from Samuel, everyone understood, counted as high praise indeed. Pearl wore her mother's wedding dress, altered and mended with careful stitches, and she thought, as she walked down the small aisle formed by rows of borrowed chairs in her own front yard, of her mother, who had waited too long for a husband to solve problems he never could, and of her father, proud and flawed and gone now to whatever rest awaited him. And she felt, rather than sadness, a kind of settled peace. She had honored her parents by refusing to repeat their mistakes, and in doing so had found something neither of them, for all their years together, had ever quite managed to hold. A partnership built on equal honesty, equal labor, equal love. The combined operation of the Garner and Keller ranches, which they eventually simply called the Keller-Garner Ranch, a name Pearl insisted upon over Marcus's initial protest that her name ought to come first given the history of the land, prospered in the years that followed. They expanded the herd carefully, invested in better breeding stock, weathered 2 more hard winters with the kind of preparation and honest accounting Pearl had learned through hard necessity, and slowly built a reputation in the territory, not merely for successful ranching, but for a kind of fairness in their dealings that drew good hands and loyal buyers alike. Their first child, a son, was born in the summer of 1888, nearly 9 months to the day after their wedding, a fact that Pearl's aunt from Missouri, visiting for the birth, remarked upon with a raised eyebrow and a knowing smile that made Pearl blush furiously despite being a married woman with every right to such matters. They named him Elias after Pearl's father, a choice that surprised Marcus at first. "I thought you wanted to leave his pride behind," Marcus said, holding the swaddled infant with the careful, slightly terrified tenderness of a new father. "I have left his pride behind," Pearl said, watching her husband with their son, feeling a love so large it seemed to fill the whole small bedroom. "But I have kept what was good in him, his hard work, his love for this land, even his stubbornness, which I think our son has already inherited given how he refused to be born until well past when the midwife predicted. I would rather remember my father for what he built than for what he broke." Marcus looked up at her, his eyes soft. "That is a wise way to carry a memory," he said. "I learned it from surviving him," Pearl said simply. 2 years later came their second child, a daughter they named Rose, after Marcus's late wife, a choice Pearl herself suggested when Marcus hesitated to bring it up. "She was part of who you were before me," Pearl said, when Marcus expressed surprise and gratitude in equal measure at the suggestion. "I do not want you to feel you must hide that part of your life to make room for ours. Love does not work by subtraction, Marcus. There is room in this family for every good thing that came before, so long as it makes room, in turn, for what we are building now." Marcus had wept a little at that, and Pearl had held him, and thought that this willingness to make room for grief and joy both, was perhaps the truest measure of the marriage they had built, stronger and more honest than either of them could have managed alone. The Keller-Garner ranch continued to grow over the following decade. Tobias Reyes, who had started as a hired hand barely out of boyhood, eventually married a young woman from Prosperity Creek and took on a position as full foreman of the operation, trusted with responsibilities that would have seemed impossible to imagine in those early desperate months of the cattle drive. Samuel Otto worked with them until his health began to fail in his 60s, at which point Pearl and Marcus insisted he retire to a small cottage on their land rather than fend for himself elsewhere, an arrangement he grumbled about accepting but clearly appreciated, spending his final years telling increasingly exaggerated stories to the growing brood of Keller-Garner children about the great storm on the drive to Cheyenne. Whitfield, the banker, eventually left Prosperity Creek for a position in Denver, though not before extending, on 2 separate occasions during hard years, generous terms to the Keller-Garner ranch that Pearl suspected had less to do with sound banking practice and more to do with a grudging respect earned that first difficult spring. Pearl never forgot the coldness of that first foreclosure notice, but she found, as the years passed, that she held less bitterness about it than she might have expected, understanding that Whitfield, too, had simply been a man doing a hard job in a hard territory, and that the true measure of the injustice her father's pride had wrought was something she had ultimately overcome rather than something that needed continued resentment to remain meaningful. She thought often in those years about the particular injustice of a world where a woman's worth on the land was so often measured by the men around her, by a father's name, a husband's reputation, rather than by her own labor and judgment. She made a point, as the ranch prospered, of ensuring that any woman who came seeking work or fair dealing from the Keller-Garner ranch received exactly that, fair dealing, regardless of what the wider custom of the territory might have suggested was owed to her. She hired a widow named Constance Ferris to keep the ranch's books when her own hands grew too full with children and cattle both to manage every ledger herself, paying her the same wage a man would have earned for the same careful work. A decision that raised eyebrows in town, but that Pearl never once reconsidered. "You are building quite a reputation for yourself," Marcus told her one evening, some 6 years into their marriage, as they sat on the porch watching their 3 children, for a third had arrived by then, a son named Samuel after the old ranch hand, chase fireflies in the deepening dusk. "Half the town calls you the fairest dealer in the territory, and the other half calls you a woman who has forgotten her place." "Let them call me what they like," Pearl said, leaning her head against his shoulder, feeling the familiar warmth and solidity of him beside her, a comfort that had never once, in all their years together, grown ordinary or unremarkable to her. "I know what I have built, and I know what it cost me to build it, and I do not need the approval of every gossip in Prosperity Creek to know it was worth building." "No," Marcus agreed, pressing a kiss to the top of her head, "I do not suppose you do." By the turn of the century, the Keller-Garner ranch had become one of the most respected operations in the eastern Colorado territory, weathering droughts and hard winters and the slow encroachment of barbed wire fencing that changed the character of ranching across the whole region, adapting each time with the same careful, honest planning that had first saved Pearl's inheritance all those years before. Their children grew, 4 in total by the time Pearl reached her 40th year, Elias and Rose and Samuel, and finally a daughter named Grace, born when Pearl was 38 and had believed her childbearing years behind her, a surprise that both she and Marcus welcomed with the particular tenderness reserved for unexpected late blessings. Elias, the eldest, grew into a young man very much like his grandfather in his love for the land and his natural authority among the ranch hands, but with none of the pride that had nearly destroyed everything his grandfather built. He took over increasing responsibility for the ranch's daily operation as Marcus and Pearl aged, having learned, from careful parents determined not to repeat old mistakes, the importance of honest accounting and asking for help when help was needed. Rose, quieter and more thoughtful than her brother, developed a fondness for the old stories Samuel Otto told before his passing, and eventually wrote down many of them, along with the story of her own parents' courtship during that difficult first spring, in a small journal that would be treasured by the family for generations, a written record of how a woman's grit and a good man's steady kindness had turned near ruin into lasting prosperity. On a spring evening in 1907, 20 years after that first terrible morning when the foreclosure notice had been nailed to her door, Pearl Garner Keller stood again on the porch of the ranch house, now a much larger and better maintained structure than the one she had inherited, watching her grandchildren, Elia's own 2 sons, playing in the yard while the sun set in that same familiar wash of amber and rose that had first drawn Marcus's eye at the fence line all those years before. Marcus came to stand beside her, older now, his hair gone gray at the temples but his frame still strong from decades of ranch work, his hand finding hers with the easy familiarity of 2 people who had spent half their lives learning every gesture and habit of the other. "Do you ever think about that morning?" he asked. "When you came to my fence line with the shotgun?" Pearl laughed softly, the sound warm in the cooling evening air. "Often," she said. "I think about how frightened I was, and how certain I was that fear did not matter, that I had to act regardless. I think my father would be surprised if he could see all this." She gestured at the ranch spread out before them, the barns and the pastures and the cattle grazing in the long light, to know it was built not on pride but on the willingness to admit I needed help and was not too proud to ask for it. "I think he would be proud of you," Marcus said. "Not the kind of pride that kept him from telling you the truth, but the honest kind, the kind that comes from watching someone you love become exactly who they were always meant to be." "I hope so," Pearl said, leaning into him, feeling the same solid warmth she had felt that stormy night on the cattle drive so many years before, a warmth that had never once faded in all the years since. "I buried his pride and his debts together that first week, right there beside his grave. I think it was the only way I could have built any of this. There was no room for his kind of pride in what I needed to become." "And what did you become instead?" Marcus asked, though she suspected he already knew the answer, had known it for 20 years, had loved her precisely because of it. "Someone who understands that real strength is not in refusing help," Pearl said, "but in having the courage to ask for it and the grace to give it freely when it is asked of you in turn. That is what I hope our children inherit from us. Not land, though I hope they keep the land too, but that understanding. That is the only inheritance that ever truly mattered." Marcus turned to her then, framing her face gently in his weathered hands, looking at her with the same steady, watchful tenderness she had first noticed in him at that fence line 20 years before, a look that had only deepened and grown richer with 2 decades of shared life. "I love you, Pearl Garner Keller," he said, "as much today as I did the evening I first told you so, and more besides, because now I have 20 years of watching you build something extraordinary to add to that love." "I love you too, Marcus," Pearl said, "more than I have words to properly say, though I suspect after 20 years of marriage, you already know that without my needing to say it at all." "I like hearing it anyway," Marcus said, smiling, and he kissed her there on the porch as the sun finished setting and their grandchildren's laughter carried across the yard, and the ranch that had nearly been lost to a dead man's pride stood solid and prosperous around them, built not from inheritance but from love and labor, and the particular grace of 2 people who had found in each other exactly the partnership neither had known to hope for until it arrived. They stood there together until the last light faded and the first stars began to prick through the darkening sky, exactly as they had that first evening at the fence line, and Pearl thought, as she had thought many times over the years, that she would not trade a single hardship of that terrible first spring for an easier path that might never have led her to this porch. This man, this life so thoroughly and thoroughly her own. The Keller-Garner ranch continued for many years after, passed eventually to Elias and his own growing family. The story of Pearl Garner's desperate spring, and the neighbor who helped her save everything becoming something of a local legend in Prosperity Creek, told and retold at gatherings and celebrations. A story of grit and grace, and the particular kind of love that grows not from grand gestures but from showing up, again and again. When the storm comes and the herd threatens to scatter, and the debts seem impossible to overcome. And Pearl herself, in her later years, would often tell her grandchildren, gathered around her on the same porch where she had once stood with a shotgun she did not know how to fire, that the greatest lesson of her life had come not from her father's pride, which had nearly destroyed everything, but from the willingness to bury that pride, to ask for help when help was needed, and to recognize, when a good man rode up with steady hands and an honest heart, that love, real love, was worth every risk it took to let it in. "Your grandfather," she would say, squeezing Marcus's hand where it rested in hers, both of them gray now and slower than they once had been but no less devoted, taught me that asking for help is not weakness. It is the beginning of everything good that follows. Remember that, all of you, when your own hard seasons come. There is no shame in the asking. There is only the greater shame in refusing and losing everything to a pride that was never worth the cost. And so the story would be told again, each generation adding its own small details, its own understanding, but the heart of it remaining always the same. A woman who buried her father's pride and rebuilt from the ashes, and a man who showed up at the fence line with steady hands and a willing heart, and a love between them that had grown, over 20 years and more, into something as solid and lasting as the land itself.